I'm really happy to be here and be able to talk to you guys and meet with you guys. The ground on projects and ways to do things in the Colorado River Basin is still a little wobbly, but hopefully we can help provide some grounding for ourselves amidst some great opportunities, but still a lot of uncertainty. I'm just really happy that we have something to actually report on. Congress did come through and actually pass something before this meeting happened, so that's helpful. But it's still a little uncertain. So we're going to try to navigate a little bit through both what we do know and what we're kind of maybe hoping will still happen with the two bills that have been in Congress for a while. And then the rest of the panel will delve into the details of the programs for those. So we're waiting for it to come up here real quick. So we're bridging the gaps between the opportunities and the needs right now, and hopefully we can get there. Let me see, there we go. So we're going to focus, I'm going to just lay the groundwork for it and focus on the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bills right now, the Infrastructure Act. Not surprisingly, usually when we talk about federal infrastructure investment, it's the big traditional kind of dams and conveyance and irrigation projects, and the infrastructure bill is no different. But it has those kind of things, but at the same time, it has a twist to it, and a lot of it is that the current bill has new investments that focus on the priorities that include water resiliencies, and there's a lot of opportunity here across the country, as well as specifically in the Colorado River Basin, and there's a lot of nature-based efficiencies that we can come with that. It was passed, the infrastructure bill has basically $550 billion of new spending. It is time limited in a way that the money stops coming at 2026, okay? It does focus on traditional infrastructure, and there is a Western water infrastructure title component, but there's other water elements as well. And then we have the reconciliation bill, which is not yet passed. It's the Build Back Better Act. It is potentially $1.75 trillion in new spending over 10 years, of which there's climate investments and climate resilience opportunities. It is not passed yet, though. Let's see. How do I get it to go? Next. How do you do it? Thank you. There we go. So the Infrastructure Act has passed out of both chambers of Congress and is ready for President Biden to sign into law, which has been reported to expected to happen quickly, whenever that is. The Build Back Better Act the House is potentially reportedly going to vote on it next week. Reportedly, because they've reported that they're going to vote on it a couple times and they haven't. So don't hold your breath completely, but that's the new plan. The progressive Democrats wanted to have the Build Back Better Act voted on first so that they can have the leverage to get what they wanted in that act. It's more of so the traditional infrastructure was the infrastructure bill, and then this is the Build Back Better Act is reported as the social infrastructure with a climate element to it. But the infrastructure bill did pass, and the moderate Dems want to make sure that they can get the Build Back Better Act passed soon. It will then need to go to the Senate. It has not passed the Senate yet. It's not likely going to get any Republican votes in the Senate, so they need all 50 senators from the Democrats to vote for it. And so there's a back and forth to that. There's potentially going to be changes, and then it would have to be in conference. And so we call it maybe the Christmas bill, in the sense of if it goes well. Let's hitting all the buttons. There we go. So let's focus on the infrastructure bill first. We have specific to the Colorado River, two significant elements. There's two titles in the infrastructure bill, the Title 8 and Title 9. Title 9 is the Western infrastructure element. It has these elements that are listed on this slide. The Colorado River specific components are $300 million for drought contingency planning for implementing the drought contingency plan that was passed in 2019. 50 million of that is specifically set aside for the upper basin to implement the drought contingency plan as enacted for the upper basin. There's an additional 50 million for species protection under the Upper Colorado River, the San Juan River, and the Grand Canyon Protection Act, as well as the multi-species conservation program in the lower basin. So it gives us some funding to work with between now and 2026 for those kind of things. It is not specific as to what needs to happen for those. The drought contingency plan doesn't identify what program it's going to go through. It doesn't identify what projects or activities need to take place. It's just to help implement the drought contingency plan. So there's a lot of open space to play in that. In addition, under the Western Wide Infrastructure title, we have a lot of nature-based opportunities. $400 million additional to the Water Smart program for water conservation and efficiency projects, of which 100 million will be for nature infrastructure projects included in that. On top of it is $100 million for the Cooperative Watershed Management Program, which is in the Water Smart program, but it's specifically for watershed-based program activities. An additional 350 million. It starts to sound like Monopoly money after a while, and I start to lose myself. So Jordan, the whole tongue wagging thing, I start saying all these numbers and I start thinking that myself. 350 million for aquatic ecosystem restoration projects through Water Smart programming. These are existing programs, so it's not necessarily, these could start going here shortly. And then we have close to $7 billion worth of traditional infrastructure for aging ag infrastructure for projects that they've identified, for water recycling and reuse, of which 450 is for large water recycling projects. That specifically, the way it's written, will likely go to the Metropolitan Water District program that is being funded or pursued with Southern Nevada and CAP in Arizona to do a recycling reuse program for Colorado River water. And then there's 2.9 billion for surface water and groundwater storage and conveyance and rural water projects, desal and dam safety. I kind of clumped those together simply because they're not specific to, they kind of identify specific projects of existing things that they want to work on that aren't specific to the Colorado River Basin, but there might be a little bit of opportunity if we watch them. And we want to make sure, if we can, how those projects go don't have a negative impact on the sustainability and resilience of the water resources. So keeping an eye on that. And I went backwards. There we go. That's not all. That was just the reclamation side of things. That was Title 9. Now we have Title 8. And it's a lot of the broad-based ecosystem, forest protection and resilience kind of activities, of which we have, we're just listing some of them here, the Legacy Road and Trail Remediation Program, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, Ecological Forest Health Restoration Program. Wildfire is a big one, 900 million for protection, mitigation, and restoration, and aquatic landscapes. And then there's a couple, I would say that all of these are applicable to tribes, but there are 3 things that are specifically called out for tribal attention. There's the tribal settlements where there's existing settlements and they don't have enough funding, and they have now 2.5 billion to inject into those funds to help satisfy those settlements. There's 250 million for irrigation and power systems, dam safety, and water sanitation. This is not their drinking water component. This is separate from that. That's a different title. This is simply for the infrastructure component of it. And then there's climate resilience of 216 million specified for tribes. So that was infrastructure. If reconciliation passes, we plus up a lot of things in addition to what we just talked about. It's probably more focused on the public lands components of it. There's a lot for forest and forest management and restoration, 40 billion potentially. These numbers can change. This is the thing that has not passed. This is what they're fighting about, that it's too expensive and what's coming in and what's going out. So this is not settled ground. This is the wobbly ground still. But we have potentially, I'm going to highlight the $27.5 billion in USDA conservation programming. That's where we can get the NRCS and everybody involved in projects that might be important to us. And there's the Civilian Climate Corps, which is 7 billion. It's not for one particular agency. Using kind of the AmeriCorps template, they would be creating a potential capacity that we could develop relationships with people to in different agencies, within Interior, within Ag, within EPA, within all of the different, Army Corps, and have a climate corps set up to help with climate resilience projects. There's also environmental quality components, conservation stewardship. I mean, the list, and you guys, we'll give you guys the slides for this. There's a lot of things online talking about trying to summarize all of the elements. Again, it feels like monopoly money, but now what we need to figure out is how to deal with the programs or the money and make sure the money can get to the right programs and projects. So right now, when we've been talking to the people that we know in the federal government, they're going to try to get this money through made available through existing grant and loan programs as soon as possible. They don't want to have to do a whole bunch of new rulemaking, if at all possible. Some programs, though, are new and brand new, and they are going to need to do rulemakings. As I had identified, the infrastructure bill is a 5-year bill. It sunsets at 2026. It doesn't mean all the money has to be spent by then, but it has to be kind of encumbered and identified by then. The Build Back Better Act is 10 years or less. Shovel-ready projects, particularly for programs without match requirements, those will be up and coming. There are some of the programs that they'll get into have more match elements to them, but some of them do not. And those we could probably hit the ground running quicker if we know what we're doing with them. And the opportunities that we see for federal spending include the NRCS committees, BLM advisory councils, and the Forest Service advisory committees right now. So I'll let Alex go.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so Alex Funk, I'm with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I'm our Director of Water Resources. If you're not familiar with TRCP, we are a national organization. Our work focuses on guaranteeing all Americans a quality place to hunt and fish, and that includes working with a broad, diverse partnership network of outdoor recreation and hunting and fishing groups across the country, including in Colorado and other Western states. Our role, just to provide some background in terms of working with the Colorado River, sort of other NGOs, is that I serve on the federal team. And so basically my primary role is ensuring that, the funds that Karen just went over are delivered to projects in the West and support our NGO partners in the West. And so we'll be kind of working on coordinating as those funds leave DC to some of these agency partners on the ground. With that, I wanted to kind of just give a quick overview of some of the funding that is specific in the infrastructure bill that is related to transactional work and potentially the reconciliation bill as well. And so to kind of get there a little bit, so just by way of background, so I'm fairly new to the TRCP. Prior to this, I worked for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, Colorado Water Conservation Board. I was our Ag Water Resources Specialist, but also managed the state's Alternative Transfer Methods program that was mentioned yesterday. And so it was our primary source of contact for funding water sharing arrangements in Colorado. And so with that, I kind of come to this issue with very much an Upper Basin Colorado perspective, and I'll kind of discuss why that is, but really because the terminology used in Colorado and the Upper Basin is really different in terms of when we talk about transactions, to the point where it's like much narrower than some of the things that we were talking about yesterday. And the big thing in Colorado, which was also touched on, was this focus on alternative transfer methods or collaborative water sharing agreements. And there's been a lot of effort to sort of create more flexibility in water sharing arrangements in the state, to promote these alternative approaches that minimize permanent dry up, help promote voluntary, temporary, and compensated approaches to water management in the state in ways that benefit local communities, preserve open space, enhance environmental and recreational flows. And the big push there has been to honestly move a lot of this out of the traditional change of use water court process into more administrative tools that are administered through our state engineer's office. And so And then, we had the state does have a unique grant program that funds a holistic sort of approach to putting these projects together. And why I kind of mentioned this, and we touched on this a little bit yesterday, but in Colorado, we sort of get hung up on these two definitions. One is conservation and then efficiency. In Colorado, if you want to have a legal supply of water move to a new use, we typically talk about conserved consumptive use as the pathway towards generating that transaction. And so to sort of get to that conserved consumptive use, you have to you reduce yields on your crops. And so we're kind of limited in terms of the practices that we are legally sort of allowed to utilize to transfer that water. And so we're talking about fallowing, maybe marginal land retirement, split season leasing, deficit irrigation, changing crop types, although that has not really been administered by the state at all in Colorado. And then potentially muni and industrial conservation and reuse as well. But most of the funding that the state utilizes really goes to conservation on the ag side. And so really when we're talking about transactions, particularly in the upper basin states, we are talking about reducing that CU to generate that transferable water to a new beneficial use. We also touched on efficiency yesterday. In the upper basin states, generally that does not generate transferable water. And I know that has been sort of the issue on why we're kind of like behind some of the Pacific Northwest states and Oregon, for example, which does allow for some of those efficiency savings to be utilized for in-stream flow use, but that typically is not allowed in the upper basin states. Although it does sound like, it is an opening to work with producers to get into longer term conservation agreements. But I'll kind of get to like why that distinction is important in a minute, because a lot of the federal funding does fund that efficiency work, but there are fewer programs that really fund that conservation work, which is a challenge. And then there's sort of the components of the transaction. And so like when we were kind of working on these, or my experience working on these, there's really multiple components to that overall transaction that need funding, right? So we have everything from sort of this first bucket, which I kind of call putting the deal together, which includes the outreach, the stakeholder engagement. You need to do community meetings about transactions. You need to hire a consultant team to do a lot of legwork, agronomists, legal, engineering, and then analysis of water rights. There's a lot of prep work that goes into the transactions, and there's not a lot of dedicated funding for that. And then there's actually the cost of implementing the transaction. You have legal costs associated with the change of use proceeding. A huge cost is actually the producer payments themselves and paying the producers or muni providers potentially. And then there's a lot of ongoing operation and management for projects too. So a lot of the kind of lease fallow pilot projects that we have here in Colorado, for example, require annual reporting to the state engineer. Ongoing maintenance of return flows. They're just ongoing cost component that like grants are not really set up to do. And then that doesn't include, installing infrastructure for measurement, augmentation stations, technical assistance for farm management. There's all these like different costs that go into a transaction. And so it kind of presents a little bit of a challenge when you're kind of looking at grant or funding opportunities, because there aren't a ton of grant programs that fund all of this at once. And so you have to be kind of creative on how you like piece these funding opportunities together. In terms of what's in the infrastructure bill, I can kind of get to some of this. We've talked to probably the most impactful in terms of the interstate voluntary temporary compensated sort of approach is that $300 million for implementing the DCP. Including that 50 million for the upper basin. And as Karen mentioned, there's very limited sidebars on how that funding can potentially be utilized. And so it could, represent a little bit more of a holistic approach to how we fund water transactions in the upper basin, or fund, really that, all categories of those transactional needs that I just talked about on that last slide. So I think it kind of presents an interesting opportunity maybe moving forward, or a big idea for other maybe interstate streams as well. If we can kind of like get just larger chunks of funding with, sort of more flexibility, maybe we can kind of set up more regional transactional programs. There's also a lot of funding in there for Water Smart. which we'll talk about, and Sara and others will talk about, but just highlighting again here that traditionally that has been a, primary source of funding to finance water transactions in the West. And yeah, so just to kind of give a quick overview, and sorry for the slide there, I was going to kind of give a quick 30,000 overview of some of the kind of core programs that are out there currently that are getting boosts of funding through these two bills that can potentially fund this transactional work. And really, when we're talking about that, it's two agencies. So the Interior program, largely through WaterSmart, and then USDA. And so on the Department of Interior side, there's a number of grant programs through WaterSmart programming that can fund different components of a transaction. Probably the most comprehensive of those, I think Edalin's going to touch on in a little more detail, is the Water Marketing Strategy Grant Program. This is fairly new WaterSmart program. It's only been around a few cycles, but is has been really helpful in particularly planning outreach and sort of like project development. That's sort of that first bucket of transactional funding. Pilots are eligible through it. I think the Utah team mentioned this yesterday, but I have to note that it does trigger environmental compliance costs as soon as you go into that pilot category, which I know is not a deal breaker for some, but it could be for some projects because that can actually bump up the amount of funding that you need. And then it does not allow for the purchase of water or land, and so it does not address the biggest cost that we talked about on the slide. There's also the WIG, or Water Energy Efficiency Grants. Just kind of noting that it does fund a lot of the efficiency side and maybe some industrial conservation, but as we kind of talked about in the upper basin, a lot of time those efficiency savings are not protected. And so yes, we can use WIG to generate that, but maybe not for a secure water transaction. And again, it calls out that you can't use it to purchase water, which is another potential big hang up of some of that funding. There are two new programs. Again, Sarah's going to go into these in a lot more detail. The one that's actually out on the street right now is this Environmental Water Resources Project component, which was new just as the 2021 Omnibus Appropriations Bill. I just highlight that because if you kind of read through the language and compare it with WIG, it actually does mention conservation and efficiency projects separately. And so that could maybe open the door a little bit to do some of that consumptive use, conservation type projects, but they haven't funded any of these projects yet. Actually, December is the first due date for that. So we'll kind of see how that plays out, but this could potentially be a more flexible source of funding for transactions, but again, still has that limit on no funding for the purchase itself. There's a new habitat restoration program, which might fold into this. But anyway, I'm kind of just highlighting that this program might offer us some new opportunities. And then there are other interior programs that are out there. Doing a little bit of digging, particularly in the National Fish Habitat Partnership Program. This is it funds sort of a coalition, sort of regional habitat restoration and flow work. It looks like there have been some flow transactions funded through that program, and I believe that's through Fish and Wildlife Service. And so there are other interior options out there, but I'd say largely in terms of funding, it's WaterSmart. And then so this kind of gets me to USDA, and the interesting thing about, I believe, the NRCS or conservation programs here, all of which are getting huge influxes of funding potentially through the reconciliation bill, are that these could actually fund some of that producer payment conservation side of things of the project. And so in particular, I'll just highlight that the 2018 Farm Bill included some changes very unique to the West. So, traditionally EQIP was, you had to, NRCS would contract with an individual producer or a group of producers. There's now language in there that opens up EQIP to water management entities, which are basically ditch companies, irrigation districts, things like that. So it could open up to larger, more watershed or regional scale projects. And then there's also this new watershed-wide project opportunity, which can fund, basically regional scale conservation. We haven't seen any funding go towards that yet, but it could be a new tool potentially to fund sort of demand management-esque pilot work. I think most folks are familiar with the regional conservation partnerships. I just mentioned that I think it's very similar to EQIP, but just on a different scale, and the partnership arrangements are a little more unique. That could potentially fund a lot of components of that transaction. And then one program that I'm really interested in, and I think could be utilized more, is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP. If you're not familiar with CRP, essentially it's a kind of temporary enrollment where a producer will enroll marginal land or environmentally sensitive private lands into a sort of land bank. And so like they'll basically they'll idle it for 15 years and it'll like do stewardship or restoration work on that. And so in Colorado, it's used in two different places, the Republican and the Rio Grande, to help conserve groundwater through actual, permanent retirement. And so this could be an interesting program, especially if we're looking at something, if we had a tool that could target more marginal ground and kind of selectively maybe take that out of production, that could potentially generate some pretty immense water conservation savings that then could be banked into a larger program. It's a sensitive issue because that does involve potentially permanent fallowing or retirement, but you could also like restore that land into like grassland or other habitat and maybe generate some new revenue from other market opportunities as well. So quick recap. I think overall, I've noticed that I think federal agencies have been, especially USDA, have been kind of more hesitant to like participate in these types of projects, but I think that's waning, as we kind of talked about yesterday. I think there's growing interest in sort of the need for that and the federal support for that. But local capacity is still a huge barrier. I think Edalin is going to talk about this. There's few holistic funding options. So like, yeah, we have all these great federal programs where they all kind of like fund only different components of a different transaction. So you have to cobble them together, but some of this new DCP funding could be a model for how we get away from that. And then we're still sort of left with state, local, private sources of match. And so it's great that Colorado has an ATM grant program that we can use to like match this federal funding for, but I know other states don't have that funding necessarily. And then again, we're stuck with very few options to actually purchase the water. So I still feel like that puts us like we have to be overly reliant on private or corporate funds for that. There's very few public options that allow us to actually facilitate that like pretty large cost component of a transaction. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Sara.
Cool. Thanks, Alex. Sara Porterfield, Water Policy Associate with Trout Unlimited. And I work connecting the on-the-ground projects that our awesome field staff do with the federal policies and programs. So thanks for that overview. That was great. 30,000-foot view of all the federal funding opportunities. So I'm going to go in depth on a few of different programs and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that these present. And, these, from our conversations yesterday, there's funding for projects that do accomplish the goals that we're after. But as Alan and Philip talked about, as Alex and Karen talked about, right, these don't directly fund, in a lot of ways, water transactions, but they do help us move towards goals of greater water security, increased industry flows, et cetera. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the WEEG program, or if you work for Reclamation, WEEG. There's a lot of different ways to pronounce these. They haven't come up with one that I've heard for the new environmental program. And I'll get to these two project examples here in a second. But we can be used for, according to Reclamation, projects that conserve and use water more efficiently, increase the production of hydropower, mitigate conflict risk in areas at a high risk of future water conflict, and accomplish other benefits that contribute to water supply reliability in the Western United States. So pretty broad. And over the history of the program, it's mostly been used for irrigation efficiency projects and municipal conservation. I've spent a lot of time looking at this program. So if you have additional questions, I can talk about this for a long time. But last year I undertook a review of all the projects that had been funded, looked at all the applications for the last like 3 or 4 years. And WEEG has a lot of promise for helping to increase flows and conserve water, but it's accomplished this goal, I'd say only about like 25 to 30% of the time in a way that this community would want to see it work. And projects really need sideboards on them and specific mechanisms to ensure that conserved water stays in stream for at least some amount of time. For agricultural projects under WEEG, it's prohibited by statute to increase irrigated acreage and or consumptive use. But we actually have seen consumptive use increase over half of the projects generally. For overall, for the life of the program, from 2011 to 2020, of the amount of water conserved throughout WEAG, 51% has gone to projects that increase consumptive use. And I broke these down into 3 different categories of projects. So category 1 are projects that we would want to see that dedicate conserved water, or at least a portion of it, to in-stream flows. Category 2 is like, it's kind of a lot of municipal projects through in there because it doesn't necessarily increase consumptive flows, but it does create water security. Category 3 projects are the ones that did put conserved water to additional consumptive use or increased irrigated acreage. So of the conserved water, over half went to category 3, about 30% overall went to category 1 projects. And in the Colorado River Basin, it was about 24% of conserved water went to category 1 projects, so a little lower than the national average, and almost 59% went to category 3. And I haven't crunched the numbers on this, but as you'll see in these examples in a second, and unsurprisingly from Alan and Philip's presentation, I think we've seen the most success with category 1 projects for agricultural projects in the Pacific Northwest. I think this relates to what we've talked about yesterday. And we've at TU have been working on a definition of irrigation efficiency project that could be applied to Water Smart grants and to NRCS grants that would require any conserved consumptive use to be left in the source of supply. We have a much longer definition, but that's the general gist. So to give an example of some of the opportunities and challenges here in the WEAG program, this first one, the Kittitas Reclamation District in Washington, is an example of what we would call a category 1 project. And this project was, according to the project application, designed to restore in-stream flows and over-appropriated or flow-impaired tributaries to the upper Yakima River. So in this project, there's a mechanism to ensure that all of the conserved water stays in stream and goes to in-stream flows. And the project's designed to allow water managers to shift that conserved consumptive use to which streams need it the most. You can see in this picture that there's conserved water being returned to a tributary to the Yakima that was determined to need additional in-stream flows from water savings. Is a canal lining project, and they were saving water that way. And this was, I don't remember exactly what involvement TU had in this, but we work in the Yakima a lot, and we were supportive of this project along with American Rivers. So this bottom example, Ashley Central, this is an irrigation company in Vernal, Utah. And this is what we would categorize as a category 3 project. This is 3 phases of the same project, and it would provide that conserved water to users. And the application says the general attitude among farmers in the area is that if water is to be conserved, then they should receive more water. And the irrigation company supports that. So you can see that there are challenges with this program, that we see a lot of these projects not living up to the full potential of the statute, or I would argue the intention of the Secure Water Act, right? We are seeing a lot of them increase consumptive use, increase irrigated acreage. But obviously a lot of potential with these as well, given what you can see in Washington. So the next one I'll talk a little bit more in detail about is the Cooperative Watershed Management Program. This used to be a 2-phase grant. It's only what used to be the phase 1, now phase 2, I'll talk about in a minute, got wrapped into the new program, Environmental Water Resources. And Cooperative Watersheds it's a stakeholder building watershed group building grant. So this, I think, applies to how do we build the kind of coalitions and relationships like Hillary was talking about yesterday, like Kim and the Verdi was talking about yesterday, to be able to move towards doing the bigger, harder things, right? This is an example from the Salt River Watershed Group that was awarded funding last year through this grant. This is in the Salt River drainage in Wyoming, not in the Colorado River Basin, but Reclamation really liked our application, so I'll highlight it. So this is useful for planning, and it has some interesting and unusual conditions on it. There's no match required. You can ask for up to 100, or traditionally maybe it might go up with infrastructure funding. You can ask for up to $100,000 over 2 years, no match required, and it can pay for staff time. So this is really designed to help watershed groups get off the ground. And you can see with the Salt River watershed group, of course, every watershed group is going to identify their own priorities, but water quantity, dewatering lower water tables is one of their goals. They had an idea of what some of the issues are, but this will help them build a plan to address it. Aquatic habitat loss, et cetera, water quality, right, loss of stream function, all the kind of things that we want to see. What was I going to say about this one? So you can also, a watershed group can apply for multiple of these grants and can receive multiple, what used to be phase one, now it's just cooperative watershed grants. So Salt River Watershed Group can have this grant for 2 years. They can get their group up and running. They can apply for another one, for the next 2 years to help them undertake this planning process. I don't think there's any limit on how many of these you can receive, but it's for watershed group formation, watershed group expansion, and planning. So, and it's also unique in that it funds planning efforts as well. The next one I'll talk about in a little more depth is this new environmental water resources projects. This is a new Water Smart grant program. Reclamation's description is a new category of funding to support projects focused on environmental benefits and that have been developed as a part of a collaborative process to help carry out an established strategy to increase the reliability of water resources. As Alex and Karen noted, this is a new program. The deadline is December 9th, so it's coming up pretty quickly. And as they both identified, also it's getting a lot of money in the infrastructure bill, right? That 100 million of the 400 million that's going to Water Smart, specifically to natural infrastructure projects, which we expect to see come into this program. And potentially that new $100 million program for habitat restoration, we think is probably going to get wrapped into this grant program, just to streamline the process of getting money to the ground. And because reclamation has a lot to do already, that's kind of what we're expecting them to do. As Alex said, this new program came out of the 2020 omnibus provisions for the Secure Water Act. And we don't know yet what exactly this grant is going to look like, what kind of projects it's going to fund. So the caveat is that we don't know a lot about this yet. But those changes in the 2020 omnibus that led to this program was first that natural infrastructure is recognized as an eligible project purpose. So I don't remember the exact statutory language, but it's like improvement of a natural feature or nature-based feature. So things like BDAs can be included, floodplain reconnection projects, et cetera. New eligible entities. The bottom line for this with these three confusing categories is that NGOs can be applicants. They couldn't be applicants for Water Smart grants before. So a traditional eligible entity, state, tribe, irrigation, water districts, et cetera. NGOs must be in partnership with a category A applicant in order to apply. The category A applicant just has to write a letter saying that they support this project and that they'll participate in some way. They don't have to contribute money. They could contribute monitoring. They could contribute, some level of participation, but NGOs are eligible now. And category C, probably the biggest question of how this is going to play out is that NGOs can apply without a category A partner, without a traditional eligible entity, if the project is on federal lands. But the category A partner must demonstrate that entities described in category A from the applicable service area have been notified and do not object to the project. Reclamation doesn't really know what this means yet. We don't really know what it means yet. And it's any, I looked up in statute this morning, it has to be a written objection. So when we've talked with reclamation, if we can show that, we've emailed all of the relevant category A folks in an area and we didn't get any response, that counts. And from what I recall, if someone objects, it doesn't necessarily mean the project can't go forward. I think reclamation just wants to know about it, right? So again, we don't quite know what that means. Reclamation doesn't really know. They told us what service area means. They just told us to define it however we see fit. So I think a lot of this is going to get sorted out as this this grant opportunity or this grant program get some legs under it. Also in the 2020 omnibus, it increased federal cost share from 50 to 75%. So that's huge to only have to make a 25% match. And to meet that, the projects must increase water supply reliability for ecological values, have to be developed as part of a collaborative process, and the majority of benefits have to help ecological values and be part of a strategy or plan for that. If you don't meet these, you can still get a 50% cost share, as has been, the case for WaterSmart for a long time, but there is that opportunity to go for the 75% cost share as well. Eligible projects, I think this is where we have a lot of opportunity to do the kinds of things that we want to see here, maybe more on that informal water sharing transfer side of things again. So the primary purpose is that it has to benefit ecological values. So it can improve the timing or quantity of water available, improve water quality, improve riparian conditions, et cetera. And the 3 specific project types that the notice of funding opportunity includes are water conservation and efficiency projects. These would be like the category 1 projects from WEEG. The second one is water management or infrastructure improvements to mitigate drought related impacts. And I'll talk more about those 2 in a minute. And then water management or restoration projects benefiting ecological values that have a nexus to water resources or water resources management. So what they did with this notice of funding opportunity is essentially take the cooperative watersheds phase 2 grants, the old ones that would fund specific projects, and make it into this grant, with the addition of 1 and 2, which were taken from the older WEEG and drought response project, drought resiliency projects. So what worries me a little bit is that all of anything that has environmental benefits is going to get thrown into this category. And it worries me that what we're going to see in WEEG is all category 3 projects. And similarly with drought, we're not going to see any drought. There's nothing in those funding opportunities that prohibit using the drought and the WEEG for environmental benefits, but I have a feeling we're going to see all those congregate in this environmental water resources pot. And I'm worried about the quality of projects we're going to get in the drought and WEEG. But we'll have to see what reclamation decides to fund. And drought and WEEG all have had or will have deadlines for this fall. So we don't know what they're funded under this yet, what they're funding. So to move out of WaterSmart and reclamation to NRCS, I wanted to give an example of a newly funded RCPP that gets at the kind of goals that we've been talking about today. This is in the Gunnison River Basin. It'll be on at least five working ranches in the Upper Gunnison and Lower Gunnison, with the goals of reconnecting floodplains, improving soil health, reducing stream bank erosion, decreasing water temperatures, increasing late season stream flow, and doing this through improving both agricultural and ecological resiliency. One of these ranches is the Escalante Ranch, just up here in the Lower Gunnison. This is Kerry fishing this past Tuesday. He installed this BDA in May, and we hiked down there, installed it in May, hadn't checked on it since June. And not only is the BDA doing really well, but 4 or 5 beaver dams have been built upstream of it in that period of time. Jordan's unimpressed by him building 1 BDA when Jordan's built 300. So I think this RCPP is an example of how you can scale this work up to take in a whole watershed. And of course, we're not addressing every ranch or every diversion structure in the Gunnison, but working across the Lower and Upper Gunnison to do these things that can help improve stream flows. That might be the timing of irrigation. That might be, what a diversion structure looks like. It can help fish passage, and also help the ag folks make their operations more resilient with a better head gate that they don't have to go, put in a push-up dam at least once a summer. They'll have a more efficient diversion that will allow for fish passage, saves them labor. Maybe, they could divert less, change the timing of diversion, et cetera. So that's really in the weeds with these federal programs. And I'm more than happy to talk about these in the Q&A, but I'll pass it over to Edalin.
All right. Can you guys all hear me? Hopefully that's a yes, because I can't hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, excellent. So I've got kind of like a dual role here today. I was going to talk a little bit about the water marketing strategy grants, and I know that we are a little bit short on time. So what I might do is give you a couple quick points on those grants and then move into the main part of what it was that I was going to talk with you all about today, which is the funding challenges and solutions. Turning quickly back to the water marketing strategy grants, Alex and Sarah both kind of mentioned these. And I wanted to bring these to your attention because I think that they are one of the grant programs within Reclamation's WaterSmart suite of grant programming that are really accessible for a lot of the transactions work that we do here in the Colorado River Basin. The water marketing grants are used for conducting planning activities to develop water marketing strategies that will establish or expand water markets or water marketing type activities between willing participants in compliance with state and federal laws. And so the types of work that they fund are those planning efforts to develop the water markets. They don't actually fund transactions. But they do help to offset some of those costs and outreach activities on kind of like the planning side of things, where potential water market participants are able to look through, you know, what it would look like to set up a water marketing strategy and gain those benefits from that increased flexibility to work together. One plus to this program is like some of the programs that Sarah talked about, NGOs are eligible to apply for these. They're, you know, Sarah was talking about those category A, B, and C type applicants, and the only eligibility for NGOs in this marketing strategy grant are those category B type opportunities where an NGO is actually working in partnership with a state, a tribe, an irrigation or water district. I do also want to just quickly give a shout out to both Erin Derwingson and Sue Belagamba, who I think are in the room with you guys today. Both of these folks have been involved with partners in the Colorado River Basin who have been successful in applying for and using some of these funds. So if you have some questions about these particular grants, I'd encourage you to chat a little bit with them while you have the benefit of being in the room. So turning to the funding challenges, I feel like I get to kind of be the wet blanket in the conversation since I've got a lot of funding challenges here up on the slide, but how I've kind of laid this out, and this is how thinking through it kind of makes sense to me. But I've laid out the challenges and obstacles that I've seen applicants face in accessing federal funding kind of by category. So financial, technical, time, priorities, and then also by kind of phases in the funding life cycle. So pre-application, during application, post-award, and then other type considerations. Looking at the financial challenges, the first that I've kind of identified is program underfunding, which might sound a little crazy in light of everything that we've been talking about with regard to infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure and reconciliation, there's a lot of big numbers in there. But I think also what we've kind of been teasing out for you guys is that for a lot of the work that we do here in the Colorado River Basin with transactions, there's much more need than there is federal funding available. And I think Alex did a really great job of kind of talking through some of these limitations. But for some programs, environmental NGOs and our partners have been encouraging Congress to direct more and more funding at these programs. I think the package that we saw in the infrastructure bill is a really great example, but the WaterSmart program itself is also a great example. About 5 years ago, a coalition of NGOs went to Congress and asked for a pretty significant bump to the overall amount of money that went towards the WaterSmart program, and Congress gave it to us. But that isn't always the case. And so you'll also often see notice of funding opportunities or NOFOs that don't have terribly high amounts of money to distribute compared to our interest or our need here in the Colorado River Basin. Just kind of looking back at the infrastructure numbers, Karen mentioned $8.3 billion in Western water infrastructure, all going to reclamation. Some of that going to existing programs, getting funding here, the Cooperative Watershed Management Program. that's going to see a tenfold increase in their available funding. That's great. But we have other programs that support our work that aren't included in that infrastructure bill, aren't included in Build Back Better America. And we really need to ensure that the level of investment is meeting our needs, and after that time frame, especially in which infrastructure will occur. Moving on to cost matching challenges. I think, you know, again, Alex and Sarah have kind of touched a little bit on this, but all of these federal funding opportunities, most of them have cost matching requirements. And often for the type of work that we do, it's somewhere in between 20 to 50%, which means that 50 to 80% we need to cover, or the applicant needs to cover. And most of the reclamation grant cost shares are at 50%. And that's a really high amount. And it's one that many NGOs, and especially many of the partners that we work with, many tribes, many smaller rural communities, they're just not able to meet. I do want to mention that some agencies can waive or reduce those requirements, but it's rare and it is not often publicized. So you actually have to know that some of these agencies do it and ask for it in order to be able to get it. We've actually had some partners at federal agencies confirm that tribes aren't taking advantage of funding programs specifically due to these high cost matching requirements. So for those of us that work frequently with tribal partners, this can be a really high barrier. In addition, often qualifying cost matching opportunities, they really aren't clearly outlined in the funding opportunities. And so it's hard to tell what other funding counts as a match, and then also where in-kind contributions can be used and what counts as in-kind contributions. Moving on, NGOs also can't be an applicant on all of these programs. I think, you know, Sarah did a really good job of kind of covering some of this with regard to some of the reclamation grants, but this means that we have to find a willing partner to serve as the applicant. And that comes with responsibilities, among them grant management, contract management. And so often it's hard to find a partner that's willing to take on that kind of like huge chunk of work. I also have here set-asides, and those are really important to keep in mind for those of us, again, that work with tribal and underserved communities. Currently, none of the Bureau of Reclamation grants offer tribal set-asides. And set-asides means that the agency is carving out a percentage of the overall budget that they can apply to these programs or to this grant program for a particular subset of applicants. So the only program that we work with regularly that we've come across that does have this kind of set aside is USDA's Conservation Innovation Grants Program. So this lack of set-asides kind of hints at a challenge that underlies a lot of these grants, which is there's a really wide applicant pool, and you've got a lot of not well-funded, low capacity agencies or entities competing for funding against cities, states, and other really well-funded entities, many of whom have grant writers on staff and so are able to create these really highly competitive grant proposals. Then Alex did a really great job of kind of highlighting one of the next challenges, which is that federal funding opportunities are limited on what they can fund. As Alex mentioned, they often target like very specific parts of a project life cycle. So for example, most reclamation funds, they don't cover those due diligence pieces. They don't cover the relationship building, like Alex mentioned, that goes into it's the initial work of getting a project developed and designed. They also don't cover things like the policy that's necessary to support the projects. In other words, ensuring that some of the participants' water rights are protected under state law. So another piece that's often not included in these grant funding opportunities is like project operation or maintenance costs. So that limitation on federal funds means that in addition to meeting cost share requirements, there are a number of other gaps that need to be filled in other ways. And then like Alex was saying, there are also limitations on what the money can be used to fund. In other words, it's really hard to find funding for just straight up water purchases, permanent transfers. On the funding side, another challenge is that we see limited funding instances. NOFOs aren't always open. Some don't come out on any particular schedule. Some don't come out on a reliable schedule. Some of the reclamation grants come out once a year. We don't have a lot of lead time to know when they come out. They don't come out on a regular basis. So you really have to be paying attention. And then one other thing I want to mention is, again, one of those things that you kind of have to know about to know it's even out there, but there's often some hidden funding. In other words, at the end of the fiscal year, agencies often have leftover funds that can be made available for either out of program projects or for, adding to the grant, the overall budget of their grant programs. So since that hidden funding is really only available to those that know about it and know to ask, again, it's only those really well-resourced and well-staffed entities or communities that can find out about those hidden funds. I'm going to move on to some of the technical challenges.
Hey, Edalin,
yeah.
this is Nicole. I just want to do a quick time check. I'm sorry to have you be last on a long panel, but maybe like 5 minutes. Can you wrap up in like 5 minutes?
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
So moving on to some of these technical challenges, I want to cover some of these really quickly because I do think other folks have done a really good job of outlining the fact that there are going to be some major capacity gaps. Project development capacity is a big one, and you'll see capacity kind of showing up in this chart in a bunch of places. And as I was kind of hinting at, I think NGOs and our partners are going to find, especially with this influx of federal funding through the infrastructure program or infrastructure bill, that there is going to be a big gap with capacity and in some of these funding areas. Continuity of programs and program knowledge also is a pretty big challenge. There are so many federal funding programs and opportunities. They're changing all the time, not to mention that a lot of these funding opportunity announcements and the criteria that were involved, those change every year too, or change every grant cycle. And so all of this means that there's kind of an ongoing time investment to understand what's on offer and also where the work that we want to do can fit. And then there's also kind of a grant writing challenge here, which is you have to be paying attention every single year to make sure that you're highlighting those pieces of your project that align best with agency priorities as outlined in the grant criteria. And this kind of gets to that next item on the chart, which is matching projects to opportunities, which can be totally overwhelming. There are so many programs, and the infrastructure bill is a really good example. There's so much in there that it's almost a challenge to understand where our limited time is best spent based on the variety of work that we do. Again, another capacity challenge with regard to grant writing. And here I think I'll just be frank and say that applicants that can afford grant writers and grant writers with experience get more of the grants. So having someone that is familiar with the grants, is familiar and successful at getting some of these federal funds, having someone like that can be really helpful to an applicant. And then developing an application can also be super challenging and really frustrating because grants.gov is just, it's a black box sometimes between the time required to set up an account and search for and find funding opportunities and the lag time of being able to submit a proposal. It's just, the NOFOs have short windows of opportunity. And so sometimes actually trying to even use the grants.gov process can be an obstacle. Prioritization and grading criteria, I'll get to this a little bit more later when I'm talking about priorities, but again, technical capacity to do the work, reporting, tracking, managing the grants takes capacity, and technical assistance is another area where I think, especially with some of this influx of federal funding through infrastructure and Build Back Better, we're still seeing gaps. There's not a lot of money in these packages that goes to creation of staff positions, and that technical assistance piece, especially at the state level, can be really helpful to grant applicants in understanding what programs are out there, how to best capture some of those funding or capture some of that funding, and how best to put a project together. I think, moving on to the time constraints, I think I've kind of hinted at some of the funding timelines being super short. Most of the reclamation grant programs require that grant funds be expended within 2 to 4 years. Karen also talked about the fact that the infrastructure bill funds have to be obligated within 5 years. That's not for all of the programs in there, but it's for the bulk of them. And it's not like that funding is going to be evenly divided 20%, 20% each year. There's a lot of work that we're going to have to do to understand the availability of some of this funding once we determine, which programs might be worth pursuing. And then interestingly, with infrastructure and Build Back Better, I think there's also going to be really tremendous pressure to get projects on the ground before the next election. And there's a lot that has to happen before we can start doing that. And then on top of it, the timeframes just don't jibe well with water time. For those of you that work in the water community, especially on transactions, a transaction can take years and decades. And so that doesn't always jibe well with some of the timelines on some of these funding requests, or with the funding that comes through some of our match. And then you throw in NEPA or other permitting processes, and it just, the challenges kind of build. Talking about priorities, I think the biggest kind of issue here is, something that Sara was starting to hint at a little bit. It's kind of like our priorities versus everyone else's. There's a number of ways that priorities are kind of identified: statutory authorizations, agency guidance, initiatives at agencies, program criteria. All of those outline and identify kind of which projects are prioritized within all of the applications. So those are, usually things that we can all engage in to influence kind of what direction they can take, but so can everyone else. And then on top of that, changes in administration often impact how agencies develop their guidance, what the initiatives are, what the program criteria looks like. So it really takes a lot of vigilance to ensure that the programs are encouraging and actually supporting multi-benefit projects and projects that benefit the environment. I am going to kind of skip ahead a little bit here and just cover one other thing with regard to challenges, which is making sure that the protections are in place. And that covers everything from protecting participating water users and also protecting the environmental benefit, so that the water that is saved through these projects isn't just consumptively used somewhere else. So those are kind of a few different aspects on that protections challenge. I will stop here and see how we are doing for time, and maybe we can hit on some of these solutions as part of the questions.
Great, thanks, Edalin. I'm going to open it up and see if anybody has questions that they want. Otherwise, I can ask some questions of the panel as well.
We've got one from Zoom. A question. So from Jackie, does the infrastructure bill funding address lack of internal agency staff capacity to expend this huge increase to Water Smart program?
It's an excellent question. I will say that written into some of the elements of the programs are, some of the funding is 3% goes to administration of some sort, or 1/2 of 1% in some of the elements. But when asking directly to some of the leadership, so how are you guys going to be able to receive all of this funding and get it out? Don't you need some capacity? And they're like, we're good. And I think they're missing the mark on that a little bit. I think the fire hose is going to come quickly. And so that goes to Edalin's point a little bit of, they might be really willing to accept projects of large scale that they can get the money out quickly because of that. That's just an assumption on my part a little bit, but I think this is new and wobbly ground, not only for the project level, on the ground level, but for the administrative level as well. And we're figuring it out quickly.
I'll just add that I've talked to WaterSmart grant staff, and this was a couple of months ago, asking them how did they feel that they were going to be able to handle this, and they were like, "Oh my God, we don't know." So it's definitely a big issue, internal capacity for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll just jump in and mention, some of our experience, I mentioned that like about 5 or 6 years ago, we saw this big bump in WaterSmart funding. And, the front end of the process, getting the applications, working with potential applicants, the current staff was able to do that. Where we started seeing the real problem was kind of on the back end. They had one person that was in charge of doing all of the contracting. And they saw their projects awarded numbers go from like 20 grants to like 70. One contract person was handling all of those. So there was this huge backlog, and it really impacted their ability to get those funds out. So I think that this is going to be a huge issue. Some of the agencies have already started to talk about how they're going to be staffing up, but unfortunately DOI and Reclamation have not yet shared that.
One other thing I'd like to highlight in talking about matching and elements of that is that there's an element in the infrastructure bill that also authorizes any of the ARPA funds, the funds for the COVID relief that were given to the states that have been not been expended, can go towards the non-federal matching of these types of programs. So working with the states to say, hey, you haven't spent all of your ARPA funds, why don't you dedicate it to this and help with those projects, is an opportunity. Anybody else? I know we're short on time, so I don't want to.
Todd, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate this discussion, and really I think any one of you can answer this, but it was unclear. It seemed like the overview of the infrastructure or Build Back Better may really, I wasn't sure if it was for the water marketing strategy program, if that was, if they were going to have additional funding, or really focus more on infrastructure. So, so really it's that specific program. Do you think you'll get more funding through this?
Yeah, the short answer is yeah, likely, I guess, Todd. I mean, so the way that they have it written is that, I mean, WaterSmart is getting 400 million across the board, and 100 million of that, as Sarah mentioned, is going to that natural infrastructure bucket. But that other 300 million would go to WIG, drought, maybe the water marketing grant. It doesn't specify like how it's going to break down yet. But yeah, I would say all those programs should get a maybe prorated plus up potentially. I don't know. Sarah, if you more intel on that.
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to do it, but I feel like there's so many different kinds of WaterSmart grants. And so I don't know how they're going to divide that 300 million that's not set aside for the natural infrastructure. But yeah, it could be water marketing. It could be drought. It could be, yeah, who knows how I don't have any insight into how that's going to happen.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much.
But I think that's a lesson for this community right now, is because there is still a lot of gray area and uncertainty, and how to influence how we would want these programs to go and how we want the projects that they focus on. Relationship building, both at the leadership level, but also at the state level, and then also on the project level, and influencing and showing people what's the important things to consider, whether it be that the conserved consumptive use does go to the environment or doesn't get reused, and all of those kind of things. We still have a lot to do to get this implemented correctly.
Yeah, I would TU alone, I think, has at least 4 applications going in for the environmental water resources grant, and over kind of a range of scales and kinds of projects. And we're just trying to make it like, this is what we want to see funded, and make it as tight and as, clear as possible.
Sarah, on that point, Andrew Perky here. In the NOFO, they do allude to the fact that if they get more money, they may fund more projects or fund them subsequently. So it does seem like the more projects we can get in by December 9th, the better.
Yeah, for sure.
This is Kate Ryan, Water Trust. When we're doing fundraising from foundations, it seems like it's important to clarify for them that there is no federal funding available for acquisitions, that they're going to be potentially one of our sole sources. And is it accurate to say that there is no federal funding for acquisitions?
Yeah, I'd say I think well, yeah, Water Smart, very clear in the NOFOs, you cannot use those funds to purchase water. I think USDA, you could maybe get more creative. I mean, the way that like some of those programs are set up, like through EQIP, like I think you could fund some of that conservation work. But I'll be totally honest, USDA has been very reluctant to do water transactional work. We're starting to see maybe a little bit of change in Colorado. I think it's really dependent on the state conservationists and how much they kind of see it as an issue, but they have funded some projects with Colorado Open Lands, for example, that involve transactional work. But I'd say there's a lot more work that needs to get done there to get USDA more comfortable with utilizing those programs to actually pay producers to conserve water. So I think we're still kind of stuck with limited federal options for that.
Yeah, I'd say that one of our best opportunities potentially is CREP, which Alex touched on. And I've had multiple conversations with the guy who runs all of the Western CREP, everything west of the Mississippi. And he has told us, like, we don't pay for water, but there are ways kind of around that with the groundwater CREPs. Like, you can pay for retiring land, and then there can be an incentive payment that comes from the matching partner that, you know, is essentially for water. So I think there's some ways to get creative about it, but yeah, it's not directly funded.
You know, on that point, the Oregon CREP actually, the state gave a boost if you leased your water right in stream. So that's a perfect example.
And the one action I would just say is that the drought contingency plan element in the Colorado River is wide open. It does not have any limitations on it. So that's an open area.
Okay, this has been a
Can I-
really great conversation, but I feel like I need to wrap us because we've got a whole other set of stuff to talk about. Thank you guys. Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Edalin, for putting a lot of that into context. It was really, that's good work. Okay, I feel like we've actually been dancing around this topic of how do you bring big ideas in a specific geography together. And so Amy and I kind of separately have been working on some like state level frameworks for sort of river health planning. And so we wanted to bring these forward as ideas that are sort of nascent in California, and they've been working for about 5 years in Colorado, and get a sense from the group of like, what is the role of like local collaborative watershed planning in setting us up for project implementation and transactions down the road. So rather than just focusing on the transaction piece, I'm stepping back a little bit and talking about watershed planning. So Amy is going to start by giving us an update on some of the work that's going on in California.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nicole. I mean, I thought I'd go ahead and describe a few of the activities at a really high level and give you like just a sense of what is in development in California. And then I'm really looking forward to kind of a broader discussion with the group to understand more what we can be doing as practitioners to move this sort of work along. So I think one of the, slide's not advancing. Okay. One of the efforts underway in California right now is trying to come up with a framework that can be used to predict functional flow levels across the state in kind of a desktop exercise. So there is a technical group, and I'm not sure if anybody from California is in the room there, but there's been a technical group led by the State Water Board, includes UC Davis, UC Berkeley, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, to come up with this approach to developing a range of flows that can support natural functions of a healthy ecosystem. And they're breaking down this functional flow approach by 5 different hydrological regimes and using a desktop tool to be able to model what the range of flows should be in these different regimes. So during a fall pulse flow area time, during the wet season base flow, peak magnitude flows, spring recession flows, and dry season flows. It's a pretty exciting tool that is emerging right now, and I think it has applications in different ways. The website there, if you want to check it out and read the technical document, is there on the screen. But more or less, it's a 3-step process. Steps 1 and 2 is really around developing ecological flow criteria based on unimpaired modeled flows. And then the step 3 is bringing in what human uses are for that water and other uses, and then working in a stakeholder driven process to come up with what environmental flow recommendations might be in a given system. I see this as, from a collaborative and a voluntary approach, as I spoke yesterday to some of the barriers that we're all facing when it does this work, is really trying to figure out how to fill in the gap in science and data and understanding where we're trying to get when it comes to delivering flows in stream, what times of year are those flows needed, and what are the various different regimes that we're trying to address. So I see this tool as being something that's going to be very useful and worth tracking, because I think if we could apply it here in California, it also could be applied in Colorado as well. And the step 3 of that process is more or less a collaborative water management approach. So it's a framework that we all are used to doing across our watersheds, bringing stakeholders together, identifying the problems, and working as a group of partners to come up with potential solutions. We over the summer put together a guidebook that really speaks to what this collaborative water management approach looks for addressing stream flow related issues. To date, a lot of the work and the planning has been around your traditional restoration piece practices. And so this framework helps to try to bring in the California Environmental Flow Framework in the last slide, and then develop a stakeholder process to begin getting at identifying how to restore stream flows. I talked about yesterday, and we've talked about it today, that in addition to that, there's a big recognition that we need to be building capacity of these groups on the ground. And I think the last panel around how limited funding is available to support the capacity of organizations to develop projects, fundraise for projects, do the stakeholder outreach. So we're attempting to build that capacity through the California Environmental Water Network. And the different projects that are coming out of these collaborative water management approaches really are around creating water supply reliability, both for people and the communities that rely on healthy stream systems, and then of course the natural ecosystems that rely on a healthy stream corridor. We're also looking at how we can become more resilient during times of climate change, or during given climate change. And then we're also starting to integrate into our stream flow projects opportunities to be able to mitigate for wildfire risk. California just allocated $4.7 billion of state funding for water and drought resiliency projects. And similar to the conversations we just had, there's a lot of concern and questions about how the agency is going to be able to roll out that much money in a short period of time, and whether the agencies themselves have the capacity to do it. But we're also beginning to look at other federal funding sources and how we can leverage the federal funds with these state funds to be able to do more, and are also looking at the Farm Bill. We've been more recently looking at how FEMA dollars that come through our Cal Operations of Emergency Services might be used to be able to mitigate for climate change, for drought, and for wildfire risk. And so I think there's some opportunities through FEMA and then others. So just trying to figure out how we can create a diverse portfolio of funds. That said, I think what I've been struggling with most this year is that, California, as throughout the West, we had another historic drought. In California, we haven't seen flows as low since 1976. And what was shocking to me is that I think a lot of us on the ground saw this coming, given how poor of a water year it was last winter. But the response from a state level in California was pretty slow. And as practitioners and agency partners in terms of responding to a drought, we had just gotten out of a drought, had a couple of years of average water years, and then all of a sudden we're back into another one. It was shocking to me how slow California was to respond. And so as a result, there was a bunch of work done around drought emergency regulations and curtailments. in the Klamath, in the Russian, the Delta, tributaries to the Sacramento. As you guys know, a lot of my work is in the Shasta River in the Klamath Basin, and we saw drought emergency curtailments for the first time ever occur this year in the Shasta. And it actually included some groundwater pumpers as well. So this kind of reactive approach to drought has made me really kind of wonder that how are we to integrate collaborative water management approaches that are often take time, slow to develop, projects are slow to implement, with the fact that we have a crisis happening right now, and we've got conditions that are going to result in extinction of species throughout our state. And how do we as practitioners balance the need for regulation with these more stakeholder-driven voluntary approaches? So I mentioned yesterday that TNC in California, we're members of this California Salmon and Steelhead Coalition, which is made up of Trout Unlimited and Cal Trout. We are in the process of putting together some drought policy recommendations to the state of California, and they include 4 main areas. The first one is that we want to work with the state and get the state into creating management plans for dry years in advance. So let's do the work now to plan for droughts as they come. And then when a drought hits, we're not off the back, but we've got these plans in place that set thresholds that outline what needs to happen and have gone through the public comment process so that we're not scrambling last minute to get water in stream. The second piece is this is going to require increase in agency capacity. And what we're talking about there is in the state of California, in our State Water Resources Control Board and in our Department of Fish and Wildlife, during a drought, staff are pulled off of projects throughout the state and mandated to work on drought-related issues in crisis mode. What we would like to see in both of these agencies is to create some sort of drought section, and to hire, a set of people that come in every day, whether it's raining or not, thinking about how to prepare California for the next drought and helping create these management plans. We don't have that drought task force, and I'm kind of curious how other Western states are managing this and whether you within your state agencies have that ability, but we don't in California. We're also going to continue to improve and streamline water right permitting so that as a drought hits, we're going to be able to move water in and out of the system easier by improving our process. And then, of course, there needs to be a continued investment in water infrastructure, especially along our coastal watersheds. And in addition to the kind of more the collaborative approach, we're also needing to drive forward and support efforts to develop in-stream flow criteria in the places that we most care about from a regulatory perspective. And so that's, what I wanted to share with you guys today. I would really love to talk about this dynamic around how we balance this collaborative approach with the need to respond quickly. And with that, I think, Nicole, will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, so we have mostly Colorado people in the room, and on Zoom, I'm not totally, I think it's some Colorado and some other folks. So some of this is going to be a little bit of review, and I'm going to zip through it so that we don't spend a bunch of time on things that people already know. But just a little bit of background. So Colorado has a collaborative river health planning framework that is state sanctioned, I'll just say, and state supported. It is not mandated by anybody to sort of do these collaborative river health planning processes, but they are state supported. And it very quickly, it came out of the original Colorado Water Plan in 2015. The NGO community in the state of Colorado did a pretty nice job of pushing the state to sort of expand the scope of support for not really watershed health planning necessarily. It's really more about the river corridor. So these are management plans that focus primarily on river function in the river corridor as well as flows. So the state did this in order to solve a couple of problems. One of the problem was that they had been prioritizing or quantifying the quote unquote water gap for municipal, industrial, and agricultural water for a number of years, and they weren't making any progress in the like 10 years of doing technical work at the state level. They weren't making any progress on quantifying the environmental and recreational water gap. And so there was this understanding that that probably needed to happen more locally rather than from a statewide tool. And so stream management plans, as they are outlined here, were really meant to try to get a lot of movement and to start to identify and close the environmental and recreational water gap, what rivers need versus what is available. The second thing that they wanted to do was to start to prioritize stream reaches in the state for this kind of a plan. So there was some directives to locally prioritize your stream reaches for stream management plans so that you were putting these plans in places where it mattered. And then also they shuttled increased funding for the Watershed Restoration Grant Program to help pay for doing all of this. So there's currently, it's varied a little bit, but over the last several years, it's been about $5 million a year in the Watershed Restoration Grant Program. And some, percentage of that goes to these river corridor plans in the state. So this has been going on for 5 years. Thanks, Michaela. And are several of these plans that are now complete. There's several that are ongoing, but these are the kind of outcomes that you will see from these planning processes. So the one at the top left is the Poudre River Health Assessment. This looks a lot like what Kim showed yesterday from the Verde in Arizona. And it's basically a grading system, a geographic, each different zone of the river in the Poudre River, which is near Fort Collins, gets a grade for several different variables. These are not socioeconomic variables like Kim had. These are just river health variables. The one in the middle is the Rio Grande. This one was finished up within the last year. So again, very similarly, they used an academic grading scale to look at overall condition, aquatic life, water quality, riparian health, geomorphology, and diversion structure, function, and sort of impact to the river corridor. So they were able to do, basically it's a report card for your river. And ideally, at the end of the day, you end up with something which is on the right. This is from the Middle Colorado River, which is sort of in the Silt Rifle, Glenwood Springs area. This is one of their project plans. There were 55 of these that came out of that planning process. And so this is just one for a reservoir, I think it's a reservoir rehabilitation and construction project. So through these collaborative planning processes, ultimately what you want to end up with is a series of recommendations on where to go next. So River Network has been sort of in the center of all of this for the last 5 years. It's a large part of my job. It's a big part of what Michaela does. Stacy helps us with this program. We have a team of folks that work on this. And essentially our job is to enlarge the pipeline of local communities that are actually implementing these planning processes with the hope that it will eventually lead to a bunch of identified on the ground projects that you can put money toward. So we do a lot of work just on like basic outreach, letting people know about the program, studying the practices and the case studies. We have a resource library that is online that houses all of this stuff. We have a peer learning network that meets quarterly, like what Amy showed yesterday, the Environmental Flows Network in California. We have that same thing here in Colorado. We provide one-on-one technical and financial support to launch stream management plans. We've launched 10 of them so far in the last 5 grant cycles. And then we do a lot of outcomes tracking. The state is kind of limited on their ability to actually monitor what is coming out of these. So we did a big lift and we created this. So we did a big lift just in the last 6 months or so, and we put together this report. And it takes a look at the last 5 years of Colorado stream management plans. So where have we made progress? Where are there challenges? What should we be doing next as we enter into the next water plan update? So just a few quick highlights from that report. You can go read it if you are so inclined, but there are 26 plans and you can see the geographies in terms of reaches and watersheds on the top. And then those are the HUC 8s on the bottom. Green is completed, the oranges that they're in process currently. So there's 26 of these plans. We cover about a quarter of the HUC 8s in the state. So we still have some work to do. There's been $8 million spent in total on these planning processes. So about half of that, a little more than half of that has been state CWCB grant funds, and the rest of it is local cash and in-kind match. So that's, you know, $8 million that maybe otherwise would not have been invested in river health planning. And it has resulted in about 200, not about, it has resulted in 269 project recommendations. So that the 11 completed plans have a variety of different kinds of projects that they come out the other end with. On the left-hand side, so we did a bunch of digging into the results of all these plans, and we compiled kind of what all the recommendations were. So the number one kind of recommendation are diversion reconstruction projects. That was 14%. Data collection and monitoring, which is not really what you want to see as an action item out of a plan, but I think we have some actually large data gaps in this state, especially at the local like reach scale. And so there's a lot of data collection and monitoring that people want to do. And then stream restoration is third at 11%. Environmental flow targets are at 6%. Recreation flow targets are way further down at 1%. So we're not necessarily doing a great job in bringing environmental flow targets, you know, as a result of these planning processes. And that's one of the things that we learned as we were doing this. There's also a lot of gains that are, I'll call them softer gains, related to the knowledge and capacity of local coalitions to actually do this work. So prior to this program being started 5 years ago by the state, I would say 90% of the local coalitions in the state of Colorado, like the Watershed groups, and they were working on water quality related issues, and they were working on like outreach and education programs. And so what this did is it gave them a pathway to move into a different water quality, water quantity discussions, and sort of more holistic river health discussions. And so it has really increased the capacity of local organizations to play in this world. And it's been really amazing to watch, like organizations that were just sort of humming along doing, you know, 319 plans and water quality, citizen science stuff have really blossomed into sort of owning this space a little more. It's been really cool. We've also seen quite a few data and methodology gains just from asking coalitions to go out and create baseline assessments of their rivers. All of a sudden you have a lot more data at your disposal to understand the systems, and you end up sort of creating a whole bunch of new methodologies. And you're exposing people to new methodologies about how to, you know, quantify what a healthy river means to their community. So, so I think it's, you know, we're seeing a lot of good gains out of this process. And so the benefits definitely go beyond like numbers of projects and in more sort of creating a movement around, you know, river health planning in the state. So that's, I'm going to leave it there. And Amy and I wanted to pivot the discussion to you guys and just talk a little bit about these three questions. So I don't know, Michaela, if there's a way to bring Amy back up and also leave these on the screen. Oh, awesome. Yeah. So we would like to hear from you all about your experiences with these sort of community coalition collaborative watershed planning processes, whether you think they're the quote unquote best avenue to reach flow targets and environmental flows in rivers. I would really like to know, to those of you who are from other states, do you have something similar to this in your state? Because I'm not, other than like Oregon does, which is really focused on salmon recovery, I'm not seeing it in any other states. And like, why not? You know, what should there be an effort to create similar programs in other states? And if so, like, how do we do that? So those are the discussion questions that I was hoping we could kick around. So Amy, I don't know, do you have any thoughts that you want to start us off with?
No, I'm curious to hear how other folks are doing. I mean, in California, I feel like at a state level, we're still just in the early stages of doing this, and I'm pretty impressed with like the results and how in Colorado you guys are tracking what has come out of those plans. So I've got questions for you, Nicole, to follow up on later. But I think too, I just this balance between needing to do something immediately to respond to the crisis at hand versus these kind of prolonged longer approaches and how people are balancing that in their states is something I'm curious about as well.
Clarifying question on your presentation, Nicole, this is Andrew Perky, on the data results about environmental flow targets. Did you also look at sort of openness to transactional strategies at all, or was it all about just whether or not you set a target for flow?
I think it was, yeah, it's more about like, did they identify stream flow targets in the planning process? And not even like, did they identify the transactional methods to meet it?
Yeah.
Like just even one step removed from that. Yeah. Come on, I know you guys have thoughts on this.
Martha mentioned in the chat that New Mexico doesn't have any, but there are some small grant programs for river restoration projects. Sorry, Martha, you saw your camera come on. What do you want to elaborate?
Well, and yeah, so I mean, it would be really useful in New Mexico. I also think that it is the way to have these conversations about environmental flow targets. I think there's right now a lot of interest by the Nature Conservancy and our partners in New Mexico, TU, Audubon, the Utton Center, to kind of do a statewide assessment on how New Mexico is not meeting functional flow targets, and really probably anywhere besides the Gila. But in terms of actually then doing work on that, it would have to be at this kind of more local watershed level scale with stakeholders who manage the water. You know, it's never going to happen from a top-down approach. And so, but we're so far from even talking about it. New Mexico just is working on a water plan and didn't even, and sort of looking at climate impacts, and didn't even include a chapter on rivers. And so we have a lot of work to do with our state agencies and water managers to even think about rivers besides being kind of pipelines.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that doing these on a reach scale or even within a small watershed seems to be what is getting the most momentum in California. We're just launching a collaborative water management effort in a very small tributary to the South Fork Trinity River in Trinity County, Northern California. And it really has come down to the fact that not only the community who has relied on domestic water supply from their little creek called Browns Creek have seen over the years, the last 20, 30 years, that water supply is starting to disappear, and more frequently they're having to truck in water, buy water, and bring it in from the outside. And so that has really motivated a local organization on the ground and landowners up and down this creek to be like, wait a second, what do we do? We need to figure this out because it's just getting worse. And then of course you're bringing in the risk to wildfires that is very real in this community. And so there's like opportunities to start those discussions with those people around being able to secure drinking water supply, being able to minimize wildfire risk. And that has allowed us to get to the table to talk about functional flow needs in a given system for the resources as well. So I agree. I think a lot of this is happening at a small scale, and it's been interesting.
It's for those of you in Colorado and sort of seeing the, yeah, go ahead. Allison.
Yeah, really great question. I guess I would kind of break down that question into identifying flow targets. I'm not sure if this is necessarily the form where those targets would be identified in an empirical way, but more so, as Amy was indicating, that people would actually start to think about it and think about that, the river does get really low in July at this spot. And maybe that is potentially problematic for the environment. And just even having that thought process and connecting those dots, even while it doesn't, come close to coming up with a flow target, it gets to the point where you're actually thinking that there might need to be a fix. And once you get to that, then you start thinking, what is that fix and what does that look like? And I think that's where you really turn the corner and maybe get a professional in there to actually look at what that flow target could be. So while I don't think it necessarily achieves that ultimate goal, I do think it's a necessary prerequisite to get you to the point where you want to try.
Yeah, I would say that that's true. I think it's opened up conversations that otherwise were kind of taboo. Yeah, for people to come around a table and talk about. But I guess there's still this question of like, well, is that good enough? Is it enough? Like to Amy's point, if we're sort of grappling with this crisis and we've got communities that are taking 3 years just to even like have a conversation, like, is there more that we should be doing in this space? Should we be trying to sort of increase the scope and scale, or do we let it just sort of keep plodding along at the pace that it's at?
Jennifer, are you, I like your comment. Can you share it to the group in the room?
You bet. Yep. So Jen Lamb, I'm doing what sounds like really similar work in the Pocosia River Basin, which is the southeast flank of the winds. So central Wyoming, upper Missouri. This is the story that we're living. So I'm really glad to hear so many other people kind of describing it. Just to hear other people talking about it makes it seem kind of more official, and therefore maybe we can put some structure to it. I think that we have an issue of, which I think Nicole just described, where after 3 or 4 years of kind of cultivating the conversation and making it a little bit less taboo and a little less scary, that's all great and everybody feels kind of good about that. But then you hear this giant sucking sound when we then have to raise money, but then maybe even more importantly, actually put that money on the ground in projects that suddenly become a little bit scary potentially. So it's one thing to kind of break the silence and convene, and that's important. Obviously, we don't go anywhere without it. It's another to then make that leap to a structure or a framework that everybody can get behind. And we're still mired in that right now. It strikes me that, this is great to learn, Amy, the work that you're doing in California. I think one thing that's lacking at a local watershed level is just access to models, information, frameworks. And it seems so simple, but it's people head down working, many of whom are sort of doing this around the edges of their full plate. And so transportation of those models across state and watershed boundaries, and no question, sharing of information about how to build the pot of money. I'd say those are so basic, but so huge in terms of barriers to people getting this work done. So really psyched you guys are bringing it to the conversation today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'm particularly excited about, and like I said, it's still relatively new, but in terms of having some of the scientific basis to start working from in these communities, and through this kind of unimpaired natural flow desktop model that is in the works in California, it's at least a starting, it's a place where we can start, and we can start, saying, well, this, recognizing, I think it's like almost 80% of California streams and rivers are ungauged. And so like absent of real world information about what flows are actually like, this model, this desktop model is a place where we can start in terms of trying to figure out what functional flow needs are in a given system. And so I can share the link in the chat or with Michaela to send out to folks in the room, but it might be worth something to take a look at for other states and how that can be done. Because I know gauging infrastructure and that sort of data lacks throughout the West. It might be something worth checking out and seeing what you could do in your own state.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I think that the framework that you guys are working on is really innovative and interesting, and I can't wait to learn more about it. Sue, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, in Utah, the legislator in 2020 passed the Utah Watershed Councils Act, which is supposed to create 12 watershed councils, maybe too big to really be effective in some places. And it's really about bringing together a balanced group of stakeholders to talk about policy and resource issues. They've yet to form one. I think the first one's going to be up in the Bear River. So perhaps some of the lessons learned from California and what you're doing in Colorado could help inform these watershed councils in Utah.
Just a comment, Andrew Perky, given that a fundamental premise of our work is collaboration with agriculture, this seems like a requisite step in our evolution of this work. But I don't think it has to deter us from doing projects or transactions. In fact, doing a project or transaction, I think along the lines of what Allison was just saying, sets the stage for demonstrating, okay, this isn't going to ruin the world. How do we engage together to come up with ideas to address these problems, both for agriculture and the environment? But on the flip side, we have a long way to go. If in the report, you saw that only 6% of it talked about environmental flows. So this gets to that discussion yesterday, which is we need to continue to push if we want to build our work on sharing water with agriculture. We need to expect them to be part of this dance, if you will, and not just skirt around the edges, or I just don't think we get to where we need to go.
Yeah, Mickey, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you have thoughts about this because we've talked about it.
Sure. This is Mickey O'Hara with Colorado Water Trust, and Nicole and I have collectively banged our heads against the wall on this issue a little bit over the last few years, but I'm really encouraged to see some of what Amy's talking about in California, and I think merging that with some of the stream management planning work that's happening in Colorado could be really beneficial, actually putting kind of a transparent framework out there to have discussions around setting flow targets. Could help get at a lot of our challenges in Colorado, but I think the other piece of it that we need to maybe think about is I think we're avoiding the flows conversation in these planning efforts because that's one of the harder issues that we discuss on the community, like at the community level. And it's easy to go talk about aging infrastructure and getting money in the ground to fix, diversion dams, but it's hard to talk about peeling out water rights to put back in stream in specific reaches. I don't know that I have an answer for that, but I think we as a community need to keep that in the front of our minds that, Nicole and I have talked a bunch about this. There's not strong advocates pushing for flow targets or flow projects like at the community level. These watershed groups are doing great work, but they maybe don't have the background or the political know-how to really push for implementation of flow projects. So I think we need to keep empowering folks on the local scale to do that.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I'm seeing regularly is the lack of an advocate for flow restoration in these spaces. Like Mickey said, it's easy to talk about, oh, well, these diversion structures need to be upgraded because, they can't divert at low water. So it's good for the water user. And we need to do some fish passage things. And those are great projects. And they open a door to a conversation that maybe eventually you can talk about flows, but the flow conversation tends to derail these processes out of the gate sometimes. And so people just they just avoid it. And just for those of you that were at the bar with me last night, my phone blew up because I had a moment where people freaked out and I'm getting a bunch of, right on cue, getting a bunch of pushback. And so, but I guess taking a step back from that specific issue, I'm curious if people think that there are maybe other better ways that we should be moving the needle rather than these very slow, collaborative, stakeholder driven processes, or is that where we want to place our chips?
I'm going to jump in and kind of build off a little bit of what Andrew was talking about, in that trying to look more. And I can only address this on the nature-based solutions, process-based restoration side of it, not transactions. But I can tell you a few things of what our strategy has been on trying to scale that up. And maybe there's some things there that apply to how you're thinking about things. So one, we kind of looked at prioritization. It's like, where is the most important place to work that will make a difference for multiple benefits? So like water for people and wildlife. So we kind of looked at source watersheds being some of the most obvious places to think about first. And in Colorado, and I'm sure in most of the other states here, your source watersheds start, up on the national forests. National forest being one of the most prime places. And so we did a lot of outreach to the Forest Service, key Forest Service folks started with Region 2 here in Colorado, and talk to them about how are you thinking about this, about restoring the natural hydrology of your forests and the opportunities around that. And what it turns out is they were very interested in process-based restoration, but they also were concerned about water rights and how that might affect water rights. So we did a couple of webinars specifically trying to get at that issue. So that was one strategy, is trying to reach out to the landowners who influence the biggest amount of acreage that there is. The other strategy has really been focusing on the water plan. And Martha, you mentioned the New Mexico water plan, and I had kind of reviewed that plan in particular too, and the Utah water plan. And I saw lots of opportunity there to put in better language around the need for our natural water infrastructure to be healthy in order to deliver that water and a better water quality and better reliability. So that's been our other focus, is policy, working on the policy that matters the most. And for right now, that's been the water plan. And so those were just two things that we have focused on. And we also did a lot of outreach to the Basin roundtables, because they are the biggest influencers of what happens locally, the 9 Basin roundtables here in Colorado. So when Utah hopefully gets going, that'll be a great opportunity for folks to be there and have their voices heard about these concepts. So I'll leave it at those 3 strategies that we've been working on.
I've got a question for Amy. Could you speak a little bit more about the curtailment orders and what reactions those have provoked with the ag water users, and whether or not those can be, I think, Mickey, as you said, no one's advocating for in-stream flow. And obviously that's kind of a harsh advocacy, but it is an advocacy nonetheless. So curious to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that, of course, the surface water users were against curtailments. So, I mean, it went over like a lead balloon, of course. A lot of what I heard in public meetings, and, the agencies did their best to kind of say, we don't want to be doing these emergency regs, and we want to encourage voluntary and collaborative efforts. And if, a given landowner is working with, an agency or organization on these collaborative efforts, they can petition the state to not be curtailed if they can demonstrate that their voluntary efforts are creating some meaningful change with respect to stream flows. So I think some landowners who have been participating with NOAA and the Department of Fish and Wildlife on securing safe harbor agreements were able to petition the state. And I'm guessing that they got some sort of waiver to be able to continue to irrigate even with curtailments. I'm not entirely sure, but there's a process set up to kind of encourage that collaborative and voluntary effort. That said, during those public meetings where the states were like, we don't want to do this, but we want to encourage collaboration, a lot of the tools and strategies the states listed as to what folks can do in a voluntary way are not, there's nothing fast. They're very slow processes. that take years to implement. And, you know, they pointed to a lot of our state funding grants that fund stream flow enhancement type projects, which, as you all know, take years to roll out onto the ground. So while I think the state was doing their best to minimize regulation and point to and support the collaborative approaches, the tools that are in front of us right now are just too slow and don't do anything to respond to drought conditions now. And so I think that also frustrated some of those proactive landowners who have been working with folks like ourselves or Caltrout or to be proactive. You know, they stepped up and said, we are doing this and it's still so slow. You can't expect this to happen quickly. So I think there was a lot of frustration. I think also, which was really interesting, is because of the lack of any sort of minimum in-stream flow criteria in many of our streams and rivers, especially in the Shasta and Scott, where these curtailments came down, the agencies were kind of just picking all the various different flow studies that happened over the years and kind of threw a big spaghetti chart on the wall in terms of like what they thought minimum flows should be as part of these curtailments. And they kind of just said, well, given all these studies, here's where we think these curtailment flows should be at. And I think that just shone a light on the problem that we have around the lack of any sort of consistent approach and framework to coming up with what minimum in-stream flow criteria should look like. And I think that was frustrating to surface water users. It was frustrating to conservation science-based groups and tribes. And it just, I think, further reiterated the fact that there needs to be kind of more of a standardized approach across the state that that would look at how we're going to come up with these criteria, especially in times of drought.
Thanks, Amy.
I don't know, Andrew, if you had more to add, because I know you were also tracking it, but.
No, I thought your comment was really good. And it just begs the question that these guys presented yesterday about what's driving people to engage. And ESA was one of the big drivers. So if not that, what?
Yeah. So we can close this conversation out. Martha, do you want to, you wrote a long comment that I'm looking at it from the side, so I can't see it. Do you want to close us out with your thoughts?
Sure. I just, I think that this is a really useful community for us to come together to talk about in-stream flows and water for rivers, because it is such hard work. And as everyone said, even in these watershed-based processes and groups, it's not a priority for people. I do think that yeah, that people don't understand how healthy rivers support them and their communities and their water supplies. So, I mean, I didn't say anything people don't know, just a lot of hard work, but I appreciate this forum to come together. Thanks.
Thanks.